Welcome to the bucket courses. My name is Barb Leese, and I'm glad to see all of you here today on this beautiful spring morning in Grinnell, Iowa. Here are some things you need to know before we start. Please silence your cell phones. Turn on your T-coil if you have one. If there's time for questions, Judy and I will come around with the microphones. Please speak directly into the mic. If you're able, please help put up the chairs afterwards. There's 2 dollies at the front and 2 dollies at the back. And now for the main event. Professor Caleb Elfenbein is a professor of history and religious studies at Grinnell College, where he is also director of the Center for the Humanities. He believes that studying history is vital to our public life and would like his listeners to consider how race and views of history are connected and why this is important. His lecture this morning is entitled, "Is History in the Past?" Please join me in welcoming Professor Caleb Elfenbein.
Hello, everybody. Sound okay? Lapel mic working? Okay. Yeah? Little louder. See if I can get it even closer. How's that? Are we good? Okay. Hello. It's nice to be here with you. And as Barb said, my name's Caleb Elfenbein. This is my 13th year at Grinnell College. And I kind of laughed to myself right before we started because when I moved here, I had moved here from New York City, and it was a little much for me, but I got used to just kind of moving all the time. And when I moved here, my first few days of doing things like setting up a bank account, and it just felt like it took forever to do these small things. And I learned really quickly that visiting is a big thing here. And that term even, I hadn't really ever heard that term used in this way, right? You bump into someone and half an hour later, you realize that you need to go somewhere. But, so this morning, Barb had to come get me to come in because I was visiting with some folks out in the hall. And it made me laugh to myself because after 13 years, you know, these parts of being in Iowa have become part of who I am. And so it's nice to visit with you today, to be here with you today. And I'm really, really happy to be here with you. This is a new project for me. My work in the past has focused on Muslim communities in the United States and abroad, and especially thinking about anti-Muslim attitudes in the United States. And so this project came out of my previous work as I learned more about how histories of Muslim communities in the United States are deeply connected to histories of African American communities in the United States. And so this project came out of that. A bit of a departure for me, so I'm really glad to be here with you today sharing parts of this new project. So as you can see, one of the questions that I've been really thinking a lot about lately is this idea, is history in the past? You know, I think common conceptions of history is, right, when you study history, you're studying things that happened in the past, whether it is 2,000 years ago or 40 years ago. Stuff that happened before, right? And we're thinking about that stuff in the past. But I have questions about that assumption, questions about that understanding of history that I want to share with you today and think with you a little bit about today. And I'm going to talk in general terms about this question for a little while, and then I want to provide one very concrete example that shows why the way that we think about history, or a more formal way of saying it, historical method, the way that we do history, the way that we approach history, is more than an academic concern, but it's something that really has profound effects on our lives together, in our public lives. So, with that, I want to start out by drawing on something that happened very recently. Of course, like once you start thinking about something, you just see it everywhere. And so once I started thinking about this question, I see it everywhere. I hear people talking about it in different ways everywhere. And so I want to just draw your attention to this image. Does anyone recognize this young man? Who is this young man? So I heard doorbell. Yeah, right. So this is Ralph Yarl. Right. And on April 13th of this year, he was shot twice, once in the head. And he was just trying to pick up his little brothers from a play date. And this is in North Kansas City, Missouri. And the owner of the home, without saying anything, without asking what he was doing there, shot him twice. And luckily, Ralph Yarl is at home. He's recovering. But I think like so many people, look at a picture like this and imagine why something like that could happen. And really following the news, seeing what came in the wake of this horrific incident. And there was a news story that I heard on the radio where there was a gathering in a park in North Kansas City, people really kind of demanding justice for Ralph Yarl. And there was one organizer whom the journalist interviewed, a woman named Dee Porter. And I'm going to read this as well, but I wanted to put it up on the screen. At one point, Dee Porter said, "We're still where we were," talking about this incident. "We're still where we were. Sometimes I question, are we in 1956 or are we in 2023? Because this is constantly happening," right? So she's referring to violence against, in this particular case, a 16-year-old young man, right, named Ralph Porter. So when I heard this, I thought about 1956. What was happening in 1956? Was there something in particular that Dee Porter was referencing there? And I just want to mention a couple of things that are particularly relevant for the presentation today. So in 1956, 100 of 128 Southern congressmen signed the Southern Manifesto denouncing school desegregation, right, from the Brown v. Board of Education in 1954. The South was rife with violence to prevent desegregation in 1954. And of course, in 1956, we have the famous Montgomery bus boycott, accompanied by quite a bit of violence against black communities in the South. So, right, she's comparing 2023 to that year. And this really makes me think about Dee Porter's experience as a black woman living in the United States. What would have led her to say this? What would have led her to, in some ways, like if you look at this, asking, what year are we in? It suggests that she's kind of disoriented with time. Are we in the past? Are we in the present? What is happening, right? Aren't things supposed to change with time? That's the idea of history. When we study history, we're studying change over time. But Dee Porter is saying something that kind of has to make us think about history. My wife, Tina, loves to call me a nerd. And I've come over time to accept it and embrace that I'm a nerd. It's fine. But I want to make this point that historical method, right, how we do history, the questions that we ask when we're thinking about history, right, that is not just for nerds. That's not just for people who teach or study history or write about history, right? This is actually something that we all do when we think about history. We all use certain historical methods. Most of us don't know that we are when we're doing it, right? That's one of the amazing things about history and the place that history has in our lives. Right, so Dee Porter's experience as a black woman living in the United States tells us, just in that one passage, it tells us that this assumption that the passage of time guarantees change is an assumption that doesn't necessarily hold up, especially when we center particular people's experience in the United States. And in this case, right, we're talking about a black woman. So when we center Dee Porter's experience, it raises questions about this idea that with time comes change. Instead, I'm really interested in thinking about the ways in which things don't change over time, right? So if we stop assuming that past is past and imagine that things that happened in the past are actually very much living and with us today, how does that change our orientation? How does that change the way that we're able to listen to people whose experiences are different from our own and believe them and take them seriously in important ways, right? So if we think about focusing on continuity over time, right, the way that things can stay the same over time, even if things around them change, even if it looks like things change, how can we actually learn to see, especially when it comes to race in the United States, how can we see continuity over time? Right, again, we all actually use historical method when we're thinking about the past, right? So it is for all of us, not just for nerds. Now, when it comes to race, like I said, whether we tend to focus on discontinuity, right? Oh, that racist past in our country. Or continuity, right? Remember Dee Porter, the same stuff is happening, even if in somewhat different form. Our approach, the way that we think about history from the get-go, is a habit, right? Now, that probably sounds a little weird, right? What is this connection I'm making? Well, I want to bring you through that connection, right? A habit is something that we learn over time. It's something that becomes part of us over time, based on our experience of doing things, right? We develop habits in light of the things that we encounter every day. We develop habits that help us get things done during the day. We develop habits that we don't even think about once they're habits. They're largely unconscious, right? We do them. And as those habits become unconscious, they actually become part of who we are. And we don't even think about them anymore. And in this project, I am thinking about the way that we approach history, especially connected to race. Oh, it's something that happened in the past. Country was racist in the past, and we're not really racist anymore. right? That is one habit of history. It's something that we don't even necessarily have to think about anymore. It's an assumption that we have. Whereas for someone like Dee Porter, her experience says something very different, right? So her habit is to think about those connections to the past immediately. That's where her mind goes, because that is her experience. Now, the good thing is that habits are totally changeable, right? We change our habits all the time. We develop new habits, we break habits. When it comes to history, and when it comes to a lot of things, frankly, habits shape the way that we respond to what we see and hear, right? We respond without thinking to a lot of things around us. And perhaps even what we see and hear, what we notice, what we don't. When it comes to history, I think habits are really, really important. So I'm calling this project Habits of History because habits are such a part of who we are. Now this project, like my last project about anti-Muslim attitudes, this project is really for white audiences, right? It's to help white Americans think about some questions that might not occur to them as they move through their days. Right, so for white Americans, being able to recognize our habits of history is, I think, a key to changing the way that we relate to race in the United States. Thinking about our habits connected to history, the way that we understand the connection between past and present, is a key to changing the way that we relate to race in the United States more generally. So I just want to give you a little bit of background here. How did I get there? What was I thinking about habits to begin with? I taught a class last year, a class for first-year students. It was called Our Habits Ourselves. And the goal of this class, so this is part of the college's tutorial program, right? So it's a required class that every first-year student has to take. Each instructor does something different with it. We have some shared learning goals, but every person does it a little bit differently. I picked this topic because I was really thinking about, okay, these are students who are very close to my daughter's age. So I'm imagining my daughter, who will be going to college the year after next, I'm imagining my daughter going to a new place. Everything is new and different. People are really excited. But they are coming here as fully formed people. They have habits that they have developed over time. Habits around studying, habits around sleeping and eating and socializing. And some of those habits are going to serve them well as students, and some of them are really not going to serve them well at all. And so for this class, Our Habits Ourselves, I wanted as my main goal, we're supposed to teach writing, which I did. We're supposed to teach critical reading, which I did. But my real goal in this class was to have them think about what it means to live a life with intention. What it means to move through every day with intention. And habits are a huge part of that, right? Again, habits are often pretty unconscious. That is the opposite of living with intention. Intention can lead you to habits, but habits can also sometimes get in the way of living with intention. So in this class, we looked at the science of habits. We looked at how cultural and social norms affect habits. And we explored the process of forming new habits with purpose. From the beginning of the course, I emphasized that in themselves, habits are neither good nor bad. Right? We talk about bad habits all the time. Sometimes we talk about good habits. But I wanted to change the way that students thought about this. I didn't want to talk about good and bad habits. I wanted to talk about habits as things that either help us live the way that we want to live or that get in the way of living like we want to live. No judgments, right? I didn't want my classroom to be a space of people feeling guilty about things or bad about things. I wanted them to think about what they do and why they do it. And so this idea of habits was really just a guiding question for reflection. Teaching this course really reinforced for me in important ways that our habits are us. The habits that we have affect the way that we interact with people. The habits that we have affect the decisions we make about buying things, about what we eat, what we drink, how much we walk in a given day, how much we drive, all of these things, right? Often we are making unconscious decisions about what we're doing and why we're doing it. So now, just like I see people talking about their approach to history everywhere, I see habits everywhere. I could turn into a really annoying person who points them out all the time. I try not to do that. So the lessons that I learned from teaching this class became a big part of how I thought about this project, and specifically about the habits that white Americans have developed around race. And I want to come back to this in a little bit to help us think about that question. But I will point out right now that this also helps me talk about our relationship to race in a way that is without judgment, in the sense of the habits that we have aren't necessarily a reflection of our core values, of who we want to be, of how we want to live. The habits that we have around race in this country are things that we learned over time, based on social norms, cultural norms, our families, our local communities. And so, right, in a space without judgment, how can we think about those habits? And how can we think about changing them? Because habits are changeable. There is no habit that is not changeable. That is what I learned from the science of habits. I'm a humanist, so right, working with the science of habits was new to me. But it was really important for me to learn that. One of the books that I read that has really influenced me recently and has helped me think a lot about this project is a book called South to America, A Journey Below the Mason-Dixon to Understand the Soul of a Nation. This amazing scholar named Imani Perry, pictured there. This is a long book, but it is an amazing book. Her family's from Alabama. She has lived much of her life in the North. She teaches at Princeton University right now. And this was her journey back down south. And she has chapters about different parts of the South, and it is an extended reflection about history, about the South, about how the South fits into the broader country, and how we understand ourselves. And there's one line that stuck with me. It's kind of tucked away. It's like a 400-page book. This is one sentence that stuck with me. Monty Perry says, "Americans have a habit of neglecting history." And I was like, well, that's interesting, right? I was always thinking about habits. So when I see that in a sentence, oh, it's interesting. I wonder what she means by that. So I was trying to figure out what she means by that, and I was just kind of searching around, and I thought, I imagine families over the summer in the United States traveling to parks and monuments, and I think a lot of people do that. And so I looked around, and I found a page on the website of the American Academy of Arts and Sciences. And this chart shows the number of recreational visits to National Park Service historic sites. And I added up, so this goes from 1980 to 2018. So I added all of these up. So this includes battlefields and military parks, national memorials, historic sites and parks, national monuments, and then this red line here is all this stuff added up. When I added up these numbers, I found that between 1980 and 2018, nearly 3.5 billion, with a B, 3.5 billion visits to battlefields and military parks, historic sites and parks, national memorials and national monuments. 3.5 billion visits over a 38-year period. That's a lot of people doing a lot of things connected to history. Even accounting for visitors from abroad going to some of these sites. That's a lot of engagement with history by Americans. And that's before we even start talking about museums. So what is Imani Perry talking about when she says Americans have a habit of neglecting history? The numbers suggest otherwise. The more I've thought about it, I've come to see that the habit of neglecting history is about two things. For Perry, it is a question of what we leave out of history. What are we neglecting from history? What do we not want to see or not want to acknowledge? She says elsewhere in the book, history is an instruction. And what you neglect to attend to in the past, what we leave out of the story, you will surely ignore in the present. Wow. She's a really, really smart person. History is an instruction, and what you neglect to attend to in the past, you will surely ignore in the present. Wow. Our habits. What do our habits make it hard to see? What are our habits around race? The way that we think about race? What do they make it hard to see in the past? And what does that say about what we ignore in the present? I want to add something important to Imani Perry's insights here. We can acknowledge terrible things in the past. Right? We can say, yeah, those pictures from the 1960s of Bull Connor, the sheriff in Birmingham, Alabama, sicking dogs on people, on peaceful protesters. We can look at that and say, that is horrible. That happened in our past. But if we assume that those things are bracketed off as history, that's stuff that happened in our past, then we can be fooling ourselves into believing that we are fundamentally different, that our society is fundamentally different from those who came before. Terrible racist past, but we're much better now. We want to believe this is true. And in some ways it is. But in some ways it's not. This idea of bracketing off history as something in the past helps us see ourselves in the best light. Now, for many Black Americans, and think back to Dee Porter from the beginning of our time together, our country's racist past lives in the present. We can think about inequality in education. We can think about inequality in healthcare, in housing. maternal mortality rates. All of these ways that a racist past continues to live in the present for Black Americans. And when we see past as past, this terrible racist past, we're a different society now, it makes it really hard to make sense of how or why disparities exist today. It makes it hard to believe people when they talk about their experience. It makes it hard to believe someone like Dee Porter and saying, really, are you saying that things haven't changed since 1956? But that's her experience. Another person who has really been hugely influential for me in this project, and I first read James Baldwin a little over 10 years ago, and have been reading him ever since. Right? James Baldwin, famous American writer, essayist, poet, playwright, novelist, civil rights activist, died in 1987. I want to share a passage with you. But before I do, I want to just come back to, again, some core themes. When we see history as something in the past, rather than a force living in our lives, right? This is a habit that we have developed around how we understand history. It is a learned behavior that reflects our experience of living in the world. Right? And as a result, our experience of living in the world has a lot to do with our identities. How do we move through space? Do people look at us strangely when we enter stores? Do people assume we're up to no good if we're walking late at night? Right? These are all experiences that we have in the world, stuff that we do or don't have to think about. And just like I talked about with my students, these habits that we develop, the things that we see, the things we don't, they either help us live as we would like to live, or they get in the way. And this has consequences for our individual lives. I like to do something when I ask really hard questions in class. And I'm going to ask the same thing of you today. I want you to close your eyes for a second. Please just trust me on this. I'm not making any faces. Okay, with your eyes closed, with a show of hands, I would just like to see how many of you are comfortable talking about race. Again, eyes closed, I want you to be honest about this. Raise your hands if you are comfortable talking about race. Thank you. Less than half of you raised your hands. That's really important. Again, not a judgment at all. Now a second question, again with your eyes closed. How many of you have talked about race with someone who is Black? Someone who is Black. Okay. Thank you very much. Fewer hands went up. Okay? Now what this says to me, okay, so we're in a room together. Less than half of you are comfortable talking about race. And even less than that have talked about race with someone whose experience of moving through the world every day is different from your own, based on the color of your skin. Given how important race is in our public life, given how much a part of our public discussions about voting, about almost every issue that we share in common, right, as communities, is connected to race in some fashion. that says something really significant for us. We're not comfortable talking about race. And we're even less comfortable talking about race with people who have different identities from us, who have different racial identities from us. Those are reflections of our habits. Again, they're changeable, but those are reflections of our habits. Now, James Baldwin did not spare people's feelings. In 1965, writing for largely a black audience, right, the readership of Ebony magazine, in 1965, this is the same year, for example, as the Voting Rights Act, right, and many other key accomplishments, right, in this 3 or 4 year period around civil rights in this country. So he's writing in Ebony magazine in 1965. This piece is called The White Man's Guilt. So I want to share a passage. I'll read it out loud, but I wanted to put it up on screen as well. James Baldwin wrote in 1965, "History, as nearly no one seems to know, is not merely something to be read. And it does not refer merely or even principally to the past." Oh, typo. There's always a typo. On the contrary, the great force of history comes from the fact that we carry it within us. Read that again. The great force of history comes from the fact that we carry it within us, are unconsciously controlled by it in many ways. And history is literally present in all that we do. He's talking about habits here. The great force of history comes from the fact that we carry it within us, are unconsciously controlled by it in many ways, right? Unconscious decision-making, behavior, those are habits. And history is literally present in all that we do. So he's talking about us here as people. He's talking about us as people. And just like I talked about with my students in class, our habits can either help us live as we would like to live or get in the way. Now, I might be making some assumptions here, but my guess is that the people who did not raise their hands in response to the first question when I asked, are you comfortable talking about race? My guess is that most of you would like to be more comfortable. Most of you would like to feel less weird about race, less worried about saying the wrong things. Your values, I'm assuming, you are here today, are such that you would like to feel differently about race. You would like to be freer in talking to people, in interacting with different people. Again, our habits can help us live the way that we want to live, or they can get in the way. I want to read a couple more passages to you before we break. I think I might actually come up just on time. Baldwin further wrote in the same essay, "One wishes that Americans, white Americans, would read for their own sakes this record." He's talking about historical record about race. "And stop defending themselves against it. Only then will they be able to change their lives." The fact that they have not yet been able to do this, to face their history, to change their lives, hideously menaces this country. I want to read that again. The fact that they have not yet been able to do this, he's talking about white Americans, to face their history, to change their lives, hideously menaces this country. That's pretty strong language. Hideously menaces this country. What could he mean? This line, defending themselves against it, right? Defending themselves against this record, our country's record when it comes to race. In my view, I see that as seeing history as something in the past. When we say, that is not us, when we see ugly behavior around us, that's not us. That's not what America's about. It is defending ourselves against historical record, and it is bracketing history off as something in the past, rather than something that continues to live with great force in the present. And so when he says, right, an inability to come to terms with the history of our country, I think he's also saying an inability to see the connection between history and the present. And saying we are collectively, we are different. And we would like to think about ourselves that way. I would like to think about myself that way. And I think in some ways I am different. However, thinking that we are entirely different, well, that means that we don't believe Dee Porter when she says, are we in 1956 or 2023? Because this black woman's experience suggests that things are maybe less different than we would like to see. It's time for a break. And when we come back, I want to give you a really concrete example of what I'm talking about here. I want to talk to you about voting rights. And I want to make some connections between this idea of habits of history, public life, race, and voting rights. Thank you all so much for your attention thus far. We'll come back together in a few minutes.
10-minute break. Thank you for returning promptly. And now once again, Professor Elfenbein.
Okay, welcome back, everyone. I got some comments about being difficult to hear me at certain points. Is this better? It's about the same. Let's see. Is that better? All right, I'll just hold it. That works. Okay. Hope you had a good break. So back to our regularly scheduled programming. So I want to give a concrete example that can really demonstrate the public importance of the questions, right? So we closed right before break with talking about individual change. How comfortable are we talking about race? With whom do we talk about race? These are all such important questions for our everyday interactions, right? The way that we engage people, the way that we talk about race with our families, the way that we just interact with people that we encounter in our lives. Born to be wild, huh? But when we think about, right, beyond our individual lives, when we think about our public life, the life that we share all together, regardless of who we are, I want to talk about voting rights as an example of how habits of history actually have a profound effect on our public lives. So the 15th Amendment, following the Civil War, extended the franchise to black men. And during the period of Reconstruction in the decades just after the Civil War, black men voted and were elected to local, state, and national office in significant numbers. With the end of Reconstruction, toward the end of the 1870s, however, states, mostly in the South, immediately created significant impediments to voting for black Americans. Literacy tests, poll taxes, violence, significant violence, right? That is when the long period of documented lynchings really began in our country. "65 years after the end of Reconstruction, in the 1950s, civil rights organizers in this country made being able to exercise voting rights a key demand of the civil rights movement. In fact, in a speech in 1956, the same year that Dee Porter is referencing, Martin Luther King denounced those congressmen who signed the Southern Manifesto that I referenced earlier. And he said, when black Americans are able to exercise their constitutional right to vote, the people who signed that manifesto will no longer be in public office. So for Martin Luther King, a lack of access to voting fundamentally distorted our representational form of government. Following the horrific events of 1965 in Selma, Alabama, President Lyndon Johnson, pictured here, signed the Voting Rights Act into law. In some areas of the country, rates of black voter registration and participation were as much as 50% lower than for white people. 50% lower. The Voting Rights Act is meant to address that. There are two main sections of the law that are especially significant for our purposes. Section 2 of the Voting Rights Act, 1965, prohibits voting practices or procedures that discriminate based on race or color. Over time, that expanded to minoritized groups, including people who are in a linguistic minority. But in 1965, it was a general statement, prohibits voting practices or procedures that discriminate based on race or color. Right, so practices or procedures, right? Anything connected to voting, poll taxes, literacy tests, right? Other forms of preventing people from exercising their right to vote based on race or color. Section 5 of the Voting Rights Act. For predetermined states and counties, right, those where black participation rates were significantly lower than white participation rates, any changes to voting practices and procedures that covered jurisdictions, right, these places where participation for black Americans was much lower, whenever they want to put in place new practices and procedures, they need pre-clearance from the Federal Department of Justice. So these jurisdictions, states and counties, need to send what they want to put into place to the Department of Justice so that they can measure it against Section 2 and ask, is this going to make it harder for people based on race or color to exercise their right to vote? Section 5 required periodic review and extension of the Voting Rights Act based on criteria established in 1965, right? So the kinds of impediments that people faced in 1965, every few years, Congress was supposed to review and extend this legislation, right, following 1965. The initial period for the Voting Rights Act was 5 years. So this gives you a sense of how a largely white Congress at the time thought about the problems with voting. 5 years. We'll look at it again in 5 years. And maybe we won't need this law anymore. Maybe a little naive. Now, in 2012, the Supreme Court heard a case called Shelby County, Alabama v. Holder, right? Eric Holder, the Attorney General at the time. Shelby County, Alabama, filed a lawsuit challenging Section 5 of the Voting Rights Act, right? That section that required preclearance for states, largely in the South, and counties of certain states. The only state outside of the South that was included was Arizona. And Shelby County argued that Section 5, this need for preclearance, was based on outdated information. Right? They claimed that voter registration and participation in many, if not most, of the states and counties included in the Voting Rights Act had improved significantly. So the preclearance system was no longer necessary. Now, the fact of the matter is that in a lot of these jurisdictions, rates of registration and voter participation in black communities had improved significantly. And the Supreme Court acknowledged that the Voting Rights Act had worked. It's a great story, actually. However, the Supreme Court ultimately agreed with Shelby County. Writing for the majority, Chief Justice John Roberts objected to the stringent requirements still in place more than 50 years after the passage of the Voting Rights Act. He wrote, quote, "Nearly 50 years later, these provisions of the Voting Rights Act, are still in effect. Indeed, they have been made more stringent and are now scheduled to last until 2031. George W. Bush, in 2006 had signed a 25-year extension. There is no denying, however, that the conditions that originally justified these measures no longer characterize voting in the covered jurisdictions, right? So Chief Justice John Roberts is saying, look, things have improved in these areas. So do we really need this law? He continued, voting discrimination still exists. No one doubts that. Okay, that's kind of a stunning admission by the Chief Justice. But then he goes on, the question is whether the Act's extraordinary measures, including its disparate treatment of the states, continue to satisfy constitutional requirements. So his question was, is the situation such that justifies differential treatment of states, singling out certain states and counties and saying you need to pre-clear any procedures or practices related to voting, while other states do not? Right? This is a big and important constitutional question. Later in the opinion, after acknowledging that the Voting Rights Act was necessary in 1965, Roberts wrote, but history did not end in 1965. By the time the Act was reauthorized in 2006, there had been 40 more years of it, that is, history. Moreover, he said, the 15th Amendment is not designed to punish for the past. Its purpose is to ensure a better future. Right? So he's saying, look, we have the 15th Amendment. Things are working pretty well in these states. So why do we need this pre-clearance system? Why do we need this now. Right? The 15th Amendment is not designed to punish for the past. Its purpose is to ensure a better future. So, right, it's as if the 15th Amendment was passed, and let's just put that whole system of enslavement and its effects in the past. It's about the future. Let's think about the future. He then went on to say, regardless of how to look at the record, no one can fairly say, so the current record of voting registration and participation in these jurisdictions, no one can fairly say that it shows anything approaching the pervasive, flagrant, widespread, and rampant discrimination that faced Congress in 1965, and that clearly distinguished the covered jurisdictions from the rest of the nation at the time. Again, this stuff happened in the past. It was a terrible past. Now things are different. On this basis, the Supreme Court ruled that Section 5 was unconstitutional. So the pre-clearance system was done. Section 2, the general one about no discrimination in practices and procedures, that remained in place. But Section 5, pre-clearance, was gone. It's a pretty significant moment in our country's history. And if you think about the way that John Roberts talked about it, right, it was that stuff happened in the past. We're thinking about the future. Right? That reflects a habit of history. That reflects an approach to history that focuses on discontinuity. Things have changed. We can move on now. We don't need these protections. Exactly one day after the Supreme Court ruled the pre-clearance system unconstitutional, the legislature in North Carolina, one of the states covered by the Voting Rights Act, announced a new omnibus voting bill, which moved quickly through the legislative process and became law with the governor's signature. No public hearings, no discussion. Moved very quickly. The law contained numerous provisions aimed at what they described as protecting election integrity, something that we hear frequently now, right? Election integrity. This bill included a new voter ID requirement and other provisions to limit early voting. The League of Women Voters, such an important organization, among others, quickly filed suit to block the law under Section 2 of the Voting Rights Act. Right? This is kind of an innocuous picture of someone checking an ID at the poll, right? Something that we're now accustomed to, something that we all have to do. A federal appeals court struck down the law, saying that it targeted black voters with almost surgical precision. That is the language from the ruling, that the North Carolina voting law targeted black voters with nearly surgical precision. And they went through the process of legislating. They went through the process that yielded this law. They said the North Carolina legislature requested information about who has what kinds of IDs. And they disallowed IDs that black voters held disproportionately in high numbers. So they got rid of those IDs. They were no longer acceptable, leaving in place the kinds of IDs that white voters tended to have. Similarly, they limited early voting. They really restricted early voting. especially on Sundays. Sundays, quite famously, in a lot of black communities, are moments for voting drives called Souls to the Polls. Churches help organize trips to polling stations during early voting periods. This is a huge, huge way of mobilizing black voters. And the North Carolina legislature requested information about who tended to use early voting when, and restricted those times in which black voters tended to make most use of early voting. Now, an appeals court did strike this down, saying that it targeted, again, black voters. This language is amazing, with almost surgical precision. In doing so, they offered a bit of a rebuke to the Shelby v. Holder decision. Remember, this is one day this law came into effect. One day after the Shelby decision. They were waiting. They were waiting to enact restrictive voting legislation that targeted black voters with surgical precision. This is from a news article after the appeals court had struck down the North Carolina voting law. And thank goodness. From the perspective of democratic government, thank goodness this law was struck down. The woman pictured here is named Rosanelle Eaton. At the time, this is in 2016, when the appeals court finally struck down the law. I do want to note, however, that that meant elections had happened in the meantime in North Carolina with these restrictions in place, because it takes a long time for things to work their way through the courts. Under the pre-clearance system, that would not have had to have happened. There's no way that that law would have made it through the pre-clearance system. So Rosanelle Eaton in 2016 was 94 years old. She signed on to, along with the North Carolina chapter of the NAACP, signed on to the lawsuit. And I really, when I saw this article, I thought about Rosanelle. I thought about Mrs. Eaton. She was 36 when the Voting Rights Act became law. And at 94, she had to sue her own state to be able to vote. So for Rosanelle Eaton, the past was not the past. For Rosanelle Eaton, right, the habits of history that led to John Roberts' opinion in Shelby v. Holder meant that the relationship between past and present was covered over. It was unacknowledged. So this is, I think, a really powerful example of what the implications are of habits of history. John Roberts and the others in the majority in that case brought a particular understanding of the way that history works to their work as Supreme Court justices. They are individuals just like us. They have habits just like us. And you can see how profound the effects are in this particular example. So, like, as individuals, what does this mean for us? It means, right, when we hear discussions about voter integrity, when we hear about election integrity, when we hear our elected officials talking about this and focusing on it, we need to ask ourselves, what is this attempt doing as it relates to the way that history lives in the present, in the way that it affects people's experience of our democracy, in ways that are really consistent with restrictions to voting that we've seen in the past. Now, most of the time, our elected officials talk about this as being, this has nothing to do with race. This has nothing to do with particular political parties. This is about election integrity. But we know that racial identity is actually one of the most powerful indicators of how someone is going to vote. We know that in particular geographical areas, people are going to vote in particular ways. We have all the data that can show us that. So, when the North Carolina legislature targeted black voters with almost surgical precision, this was purposeful. And, right, it is the kind of record that James Baldwin is asking us to come to terms with. And it is a record that spans from our past into our present. And to really understand the function of these laws, we have to approach the question through a lens of continuity, of seeing how things remain similar over time. Though we may want to see ourselves in our best light and put a racist past in the past, for someone like Rosanelle Eaton, history is not in the past. Thank you all so much for your time today.
Would you be willing to take questions?
I would love questions.
Yeah, shocking. See, now that I'm not Barb Lease, I get very excited about asking questions. So Caleb, I'm only guessing, but I'm a fourth generation Iowan from a small town, a lot like Grinnell, except didn't have a college in it, and it didn't have a college in it that drew people from around the country and around the world to it. So I'm making an assumption here that there are other people in the room who grew up in the way that I did, which was to have virtually zero contact with anybody of any other race, let alone political party. It was a monoculture. And so my question is, for those of us who want to talk about race, not just among ourselves, although I think that's important, as we've done here today, but with people of other races in this community or in this state, how are we going to get to do that? And I don't mean to put you on the spot.
Thank you for that question, Janet. Can people hear me with this mic? Okay. I had an experience some years ago at a film screening that I hosted through the Humanities Center down at the Strand. And we were watching a film about James Baldwin called I'm Not Your Negro by Raoul Peck. And someone asked a question, this film was great, thank you for this event, but aren't you just preaching to the choir? And there was a black woman in the audience who is now the dean of a nationally ranked law school and a scholar of race and law. And she said, I hear that phrase all the time, preaching to the choir. And we might think of ourselves as the choir, but it's probably a little bit more complicated than that. And so I know and I understand this sense of, we need to We need to talk to other kinds of people. We need to talk to people who don't share our identity. And it's understandable to jump there. But I think that there's so much work that we can do to prepare ourselves for conversations with others. And it's work that, right, this is a pretty white room. I'm trying to be gentle here. And I think that this is actually really good and important. And I was really influenced by the idea that if we want to actually learn from others, right, people who have different identities and experiences, one of the impulses that we have, which is to gather in purposeful spaces where we're going to talk about race with people with different identities. Those can be well and good if organized well and thoughtfully and intentionally, but they're always going to be a little stilted. And I've just been really influenced by the idea that we are actually most likely to learn the most by seeking out friendships with others, where we don't start by asking a black person about race. We start just by talking about the things that you hold in common, whether it's our families or movies or whatever you might talk about with someone over lunch. And in and through those friendships, over time, you learn about people's experiences and how they're different from your own. And so this work is time-consuming. This self-work is really time-consuming, but I don't think that there's a shortcut to that. And you know what that means, especially in a really white community, is that we do things that I like to think of as self-work, right? We do things like, if we're in a place, we ask the question, is there an African American history museum here? Is there a museum, a local history museum? I'm going to go there and I'm going to look at how they present race. I'm going to think about that a little bit. This is work that doesn't require anything of other people. There are amazing black authors. I recommended a couple of books in the questionnaire for this. We need to do our homework. And we need to do our homework without asking other people to help us with the homework all the time. That might sound harsh. This is something that I've come to myself. And right, to think about how we use our time, what priorities we have. Everyone in this room, perhaps to different degrees, depending on who is in our family, all of us could move through our days without thinking about race. We don't have to, because of who we are. Though race affects how we do everything, but we don't have to think about it. So a big question for me that I asked in my own life was, how do I change that? How do I prioritize my own time? How do I prioritize the decisions that I make about where I go and when? What kinds of vacations do I go on? Is traveling to Montgomery, Alabama to go to the Legacy Museum, one of the most amazing places I've ever been, is that a vacation in the way that we think about vacations? No. Is it something that I can do that will help me think really differently about people around me, that doesn't require anything of anyone else? Yes. So that is a very long-winded answer to your question. But it is to say we can often jump ahead, skipping some of the work that can help us get there and have real conversations with people. Does that make sense?
Hi, Caleb. My background was, I went to Michigan State from 65 to 69. I was thrust into, and I was in history and African studies, seeing all these countries getting independent. So and demonstrating, for housing for a professor. And so my experience was somewhat different from what was just mentioned. But what I have appreciated in what you have shared is the continuity has been lost with me. I have lived in Wyoming and here and actually Jamaica in the 70s, so a lot of different experiences, but you've made me very much aware of how my continuity, and just assuming, we did so much in the 60s, isn't that enough? And then not paying attention. My thought was I would love to be involved in a book club in Grinnell, because there are so many books coming out. And I saw one this morning on Morning Joe interviewing an author about comparing the KKK in the 20s and then what's happening now. I mean, they came very close to being involved with the presidential election in 1924. Anyway, I know time is limited, but if anyone's interested, I am very interested in starting maybe a book club to get to, as one means of educating ourselves in that step. And I love the idea of in our travels to try and integrate that. And there are some black people here, one through our church that I have been wanting to contact, who has had some big struggles in this community. Thank you.
Yeah, and I thank you very much for your comments. And I would just say, right, an invitation to lunch can just be about lunch. It doesn't need to be like, hey, let's get together and talk about race. Right? It can just be about everyday things.
I'm Dorothy Knorr. I'd like to share some experience, intentional experience that we had in the past. We raised our family in Chicago. Intentionally, there was an ecumenical effort between churches to plan family camping together. The little Methodist church on the corner, the Presbyterian, the United Church, in various areas of the south side of Chicago, intentionally made plans with parishes in the area to make family camping diverse. Left us with some wonderful memories and experience of trying to get to know people different from ourselves, sharing what we could. The little Methodist church on the corner years ago participated in what was called Friendly Town. I don't remember everything that went into it, but basically our church was matched up with a church in South Dakota. South Dakota invited our kids, mostly black, some Hispanic, to spend a week or two with families in South Dakota, and South Dakota folks, with not quite as many in number, sent kids to the inner city to spend some time. I guess what I'm saying is there's going to be pain involved with this. There'll be some successes, there'll be some failures, but not only can churches do it, if we're creative, I would think that a Kiwanis group or Lions or some other group here or there could make some effort to do programming, bringing people together for play, for discussion, for eating together. It's worth the effort, but there will be some pain.
Yeah, thank you for sharing those experiences.
Thank you so much. I'm sure we could go on and on and on and on and on and on with wonderful questions. We thank you so much, Dr. Elfenbein, for encouraging us to recognize the significance of the connection between race and views of history in the United States. It's been very, very informative. Thank you.
Thank you for having me.